So we're here in Idaho, northern Idaho, at the homestead of Jim Croft and Melody Eckroft. And it's full summer right now, or I guess it's early August, and pretty hot out. And just wanted to show a few plants on camera, and yeah, there's a lot of interesting things here, and so do a little walkabout on their land, and look at some wild stuff, and also maybe some things in their garden if we make it over there. So I'm right here. Here's my little camp, where I've been for a few weeks at their place, and yeah, it's my little simple spot for the moment. And so like maybe right here, there's a couple things I could start with. This is a fir, and I'm not exactly sure which species it is. Jim says red fir, but I don't really know, like super specifically which one it is. He says that a lot of them are dying around here right now from a disease, and I don't know what kind of disease it is, but in the forest, in some places, it's like tons of standing dead fir, so he's been having to cut a lot of them down and using them as firewood, even though it's really not ideal firewood because it's pretty resinous and soft wood, and that then builds up creosote in your stovepipes, which can cause fire, or you just have to clean it a lot. And they cook 12 months out of the year on wood, so they're constantly having to harvest stuff for that, and so it's like there's tons of standing dead, so you might as well. Fir is in the pine family, and a lot of the conifers here are, not everything, but fir's in the pine family, and it has needles that are generally more kind of splayed opposite of each other, but they're not totally opposite. But when you look at the structure of a fir tree's limbs, you can kind of really notice how much they seem like splayed from each other in that way. I don't know what the correct botanical terminology is at this moment for that. They also have tips that are smooth and not spiky. And one of the sayings that I learned originally when I was trying to figure out the difference between the different conifers, between living in the winters in New Hampshire for a lot of years, where there's tons of conifers, and then living in North Carolina for a lot of years, fir and spruce both exist in those places. And so fir has, people would say friendly fir and scary spruce, because spruce has points that like stick into you a little bit on the tips of the needles. So that's one of the distinguishing characteristics. And fir has this like green line underneath the needle. And I mean, a lot of the conifers have really great medicine. I mean, fir specifically, people talk about being really great for coughs and colds and stuff, and lungs, like lung congestion, and being a good expectorant. A lot of conifer needles from trees in the pine family have a lot of vitamin C too. I was doing a plant walk the other day at the women's gathering that was here, and we were talking about that. And there's so many conifers here, and a lot of people who had lived here for years didn't know that they could make tea out of it in the winter for a little vitamin C boost. So fir is definitely one of those that you can do that. And they're starting to fade. You can kind of tell that there's like a little bit of a greener tint to the needles that are at the tips, because every year, the tree will put out a little bit more new growth, and then in the spring or late spring, and here June even, there were luscious fir tips still, because this area is really cold for a lot of the year, and summer is not very long. So fir tips are a really wonderful thing to collect in the spring. They're almost like buttery succulent in your mouth. They're so wonderful. And I like to make, tincture or honeys out of those, or dry them for tea later, because they just feel more, you can even eat them when you go by. Most of the conifers that are in the pine family, you can harvest their tips for medicine, for more succulent medicine in the spring. Yeah, fir, I think I don't always remember all my scientific names. I think it's 8 ABs. Correct me if I'm wrong, if you know. And then over here is another conifer that is called Douglas fir, even though it's actually not related. It's in the pine family, but it's not a fir. I think its genus is Pseudotsugae. The Tsugae is the genus of hemlock, and so it probably was named Pseudotsugae because it kind of resembles hemlock, which is also on this land, but it's not hemlock. So it doesn't have spiky tips, but it definitely has a little more of a point than the fir does. I guess the biggest thing for me to say about Douglas fir and with identification, it kind of has these like more droopy needled, limbs, and yeah, what else? It tends to smell more like a chemically, like the resin's a little more of like a pine sol-y, like chemical smell to me anyways. Doesn't really have that as prominent of a vein underneath like the fir does. And Douglas fir is one of those things that's definitely planted a lot in the Pacific Northwest in tree plantations and stuff. It's just one of those woods that people they'll cut a whole forest down and just plant a bunch of Douglas fir. And also over here we have hemlock, and so Douglas fir and fir both are in the pine family. I like to think about the plant families when kind of navigating. It's just one way of relating to the way that plants are connected to each other. And hemlock, there's one right above this fir. It won't encounter another one maybe that will be closer up, but it's well, here's one right by my underwear line where my underwear's hanging. Right here. This is hemlock. And I talked about hemlock a lot the other day when I led a plant walk here on the land at the women's gathering, because I just love this tree. And it grows on the East Coast. There's a couple species that grow on the East Coast. It's pretty abundant in the Northeast, and eastern hemlock out there, Suga canadensis, or Suga canadensis, and there's so much to say about this. In the Southeast, there's a Carolina hemlock and the eastern hemlock grow down there, and a lot of the hemlocks in the Southeast have died, unfortunately, and we had some old growth down there that is no longer, or they had to preserve it with a bunch of chemical fungicides and stuff, and it's either fungicide or insecticide that they had to inject into the roots of the trees. And in those old growth spots, it's the woolly adelgid that's attacked a lot of the hemlocks down there, and so just like the chestnut blight, it really has transformed the forest, and there's not a lot of conifers. There's definitely pines down there, but the hemlock really creates a lot of coolness and shade in the forest and cools the creeks and stuff. And so not having as many hemlocks around now really has changed the forest floor, because a lot of things underneath hemlocks you don't really quite have as many plants, but then you do have certain plants that really love being under there, like gold thread and partridge berry. And there's actually a variety of gold thread here that grows with these hemlocks, and there's a different variety that grows with hemlocks out east, especially in the north. And I noticed when the blight came in that a lot of those plants suffered because a lot more light came into the forest, and so a lot of the plants that like to grow in the deciduous forests started to come up, like stinging nettles and different blackberries and thimbleberries and things like that. So yeah, it just really changed things, and hemlocks don't really sprout back in the same way that the chestnuts did, so you'll still find chestnut sprouts from the chestnut blight. Even post-chestnut blight, the tree's still trying to make more of itself, but hemlocks don't seem to do that quite as much, or at all in some instances. So, but in the north, because I used to live in New England in the winters and in the south in the summers for a few years, I just watched the different ecologies, and as I moved through them and noticed different things. And the place where I lived, it was a cross-country ski area that was at higher elevation, and their hemlocks were not diseased, and that was really nice to see. But I noticed going just down in elevation, like say going from like this mountain in New Hampshire down to Boston, and Boston, like, or some of the lower lying warmer cities had the hemlocks were infected. So it's just, you know, global warming, as the earth warms, that disease might spread, or that like thing affecting the hemlock will spread. So hemlock trees make great wood for things too. There's one that fell here, and Jim is harvesting the tree that fell, a pretty straight, beautiful big tree for some project on his land. And I was teaching high tanning for his bookbinding class a few weeks ago, and we were using hemlock bark, boiling it and making tannin liquor out of it. So basically hemlock bark has a lot of tannin in it, and we were using that tannin to then make leather, traditional bark tan or vegetable tan leather. And hemlock has been something that's been used historically for that purpose, along with tons of other plants. So we just utilized this tree that had already fallen because Jim was going to use it for a project, and our class used draw knives to take off the bark for our boils. So that was pretty cool. There's also a really great mushroom that tends to like to grow on hemlock. Reishi really likes hemlock. Ganoderma suge, that variety of reishi. I don't know a ton about mushrooms. I'd like to learn more, but I love reishi. And so after this epidemic hit the south and killed a lot of the hemlocks, there was so much reishi blooming off the trees everywhere. It was like insane. And in some ways I felt like people got really greedy about all the reishi. They were just like, reishi, 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 oh my god, like, this is medicine that this plant's sacrificing to give us. And I don't know what the state is of that right now, since a lot of the trees died in this big swath, and the reishi will only grow for a certain period of years on those rotting trunks. And then once the tree rots to a certain point, I think that the reishi don't continue to come back. So I'm not really sure if that abundance is still happening with the reishi mushroom. But it was pretty, when I was in herbalism school in North Carolina, it was pretty like easy to go in the spring when the reishis were blooming and get whatever you wanted. Like, oh, we're all just getting our reishi for the year. So some other stuff to say about hemlock. It has really much smaller needles than the fir or Douglas fir, and it has like an elegance to me. It has a swooping softness and has tiny little cones. Let's see if we can find one. If we can't, then we can find one maybe. Oh, well, up high there's definitely a bit of them. You probably can't see, but they just have tiny, tiny little cones. And actually, here's some on the ground. Yeah, here's one. Tiny little hemlock cones. So cute. And the top of the tree tends to kind of, it doesn't have a really straight, like, prominent point on the tip of the tree. It kind of swoops down a little bit softly and sways in the wind. And, you know, fir here is pretty pointy. Pretty darn pointy. So, yeah, you could see here the one directly to the right is the hemlock, and it's a little swoopy, you know. And I'm seeing some other trees in this grove too, like larch. They're really cool to talk about, but larch, conifers. We could just talk about conifers for like hours. I'm still learning so much, but this tree right here, we could get near a closer one, but this tall tree right in front of us is a larch. What's really kind of unique about larch is that, or sometimes it's called tamarack, but there's a few different trees that people call tamarack. And maybe I'll get in the shade here for a second, because it's pretty darn hot out. It's a lot of conifers, or cone-bearing trees, which is an older life plant form. Cone bearers kind of evolved before the flowering plants did, and the way that they disperse their seeds and reproduce is a more archaic method. Some of them depend on fire, and the way they photosynthesize is pretty different than flowering plants as well. But most cone bearers keep their needles. They're evergreen, but there's exceptions, and this plant, this tree, larch, is an exception. It actually loses its needles in the fall and actually turns orange. You know, when you go to places where there's a lot of deciduous trees, like New England or the South, the fall time is so beautiful because there's so many colors, oranges and reds and yellows. And places with a lot of conifers, you don't really have that same mass cascade of color, but then you'll have these little, that tree is probably so beautiful in the fall, and all the needles will fall off. Yeah. And then they'll resprout in the spring. And I don't really know why. There's probably some evolutionary reason why it does that. And I can tell larch branches too when they fall, or like in the winter you can really see their little, I don't know the correct botanical terminology for it, but they have little knobs around where the needles splay out. The wood has little like knobs that kind of stick out all the way around. It's pretty unique for a conifer, and it's really cool. Someone was saying the other day who was here that it's really good firewood. It's primo firewood, and I think and they like water. I have seen them grow a lot around like ponds and wet areas. There's not water right here, but Jim did plant some of these, and some of them I think were already here. And he got access to a bunch of them somebody was going to throw out or something, a bunch of large trees, and he just decided to plant them out. So it's pretty cool. And let's wander a little more. In this like kind of open field right here, we have St. John's wort that's pretty much finished flowering. Hypericum, I don't know if it's perfoliatum or a different species. There's St. John's wort. There's a little bit of spirea. Pretty sure that's what this is here. And there's a mix of like snowberry and huckleberry in here a little bit. You know, I think about huckleberries and soil acidity and stuff like that, and there's definitely a lot of little zones here that are open and scrubby that have a lot of vacciniums, the huckleberries and blueberries. And yeah, I actually don't know a lot about what the soil is exactly, but just an observation. So there's also a little mahonia right here, or Oregon grapefruit, which one of the leaflets, or is it a leaf? It's a leaflet. One of the leaflets just fell off. And when I say leaflet, anyone who's maybe studied a little bit of botany knows that like sometimes a leaf is actually a set of things that look like leaves, but this is actually one whole leaf, this entire piece. And it's because you kind of know, because when you pop it off, it doesn't peel, you know, but when you pull one of these off, it kind of has a little bit of a peeling thing that happens. So that's a leaflet on this leaf here. I guess this would be called a pinnate leaf, which is kind of like, it has more of a length to it with leaflets coming off of it versus like other types of leaf forms. There's mahonia, Oregon grape. There's a little bit of a Oregon grape berry. They are edible. They're not that tasty right now because they're not quite ready yet. And generally, I don't really find them like amazingly tasty anyways, but they do make a kind of a nice jam. And so when they are ready, you can kind of smash a bunch of them up and cook down the berries and make jam out of it. And Oregon grape has has really great medicine, the root and sort of stalk of the plant, and it's pretty abundant in the northwest and down into California too, and just in the west. I mean, we're in Idaho right now, so it's pretty abundant out here. It doesn't grow wild out east, but people plant it all the time ornamentally. My dad's a horticulturalist, and he would just plant it at banks and stuff, and it's pretty cool. But it's there's a lot of different varieties of Oregon grape as well. Some really squat and tiny varieties, some that get really big. They grow in the forest, they grow in the open areas. At least that's what I've observed. And I don't know why they like certain environments more than others. And the medicine, when you peel a root or a stalk, it's really yellow. And that is, and you could taste it, and it's like got a slightly bitter, acrid kind of taste. And even in the leaf, like, I'll like chew on a leaf. And there's a little bit of that in there too. It's not as strong. Like I'm feeling sick or just a little bit of a stomach ache or feeling like a little bit of gut dysbiosis, I will chew a little bit of this plant. It has the yellowness in that medicine contains berberine, which is also in Oregon or in golden seal, of which Melody is growing here. And then there's gold thread in the forest, which is the plant I mentioned earlier that likes to grow in the shade. Maybe we could go look for some, but it likes growing under the conifer shade. So there's 3 plants here that have berberine in it, and so all of those are really great antibacterials and good for infections and sickness. I would probably use Mahonia over the other 2 because gold thread doesn't make a lot of material. Like its root is called the thread for a reason, you know, because it's so tiny. And then golden seal is over harvested in the wild, and it's not native to this area. It's native to Appalachia, and yeah, people over harvest it. But Melody has been growing it here, and that's a great way to sustainably grow and use that plant. So she uses it for personal family use. There's a gold thread right here. I'm gonna peek. Let's see one right here. Kind of right by my camp, but there's some other interesting plants kind of tucked in. Well, maybe we'll see one along the way, but in this field there's also yarrow, which I've seen all over the country. Achilleum millefolium. Oh, yarrow. Just made a bunch of oil with it and tincture. I mean, I would use the tincture probably in a cold remedy for needing an extra component in the medicine to help produce sweating and movement, and also has antibacterial qualities to it, but it's a slight diaphoretic and like makes you sweat. Like a tea honestly is my favorite way to take it, and I'll dry a bunch, and when I'm not feeling so great and I need to sweat out some stuff, I'll just steam it, you know, on my, like do a face steam or drink a bunch of tea of it, and I'm just like, okay, here it goes, here we go. There's a lot to say about yarrow. And one other thing too that people really commonly use it for, they'll take a bunch of leaves and dry them and have them in a first aid kit, and maybe even powder them so that they could use it for when there's like emergency situations. You maybe cut yourself and you can't stop bleeding. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily use it for like a main artery situation, but like a pretty bad cut, you can stick yarrow in there and it'll help stop the bleeding. It has a slightly antibacterial effect. I think as a wash too for infections, it's pretty wonderful. Making a tea of it and having it be pretty like nice, warm, but not too hot, and putting that on wounds. Actually, I could probably do that on my foot right now where I have a cut. I'm walking around barefoot around here, but it's pretty sweet. There was a whole meadow of this summer here, and a lot of it's dying back now. If you look out on this meadow, there's St. John's wort finishing and yarrow going to seed, and there's some mullein scattered in there as well. And yarrow and mullein are pretty widespread. St. John's wort is not per se, but in the West, it's considered kind of invasive and like in some instances like not very desired. But I love it. You know, in some places I've lived, it's not very abundant, and so this medicine is highly sought after. But St. John's wort usually flowers around the summer solstice, not exactly, but in certain areas a little sooner, in certain areas a little bit later. And around here it was a little bit after the summer solstice, which is the longest day of the year. And when I was originally taught this plant, I was living in New Hampshire, and my teacher Rebecca Golden really got us to think about seasonality with plants and when they come into fruition, and like what the energy of their medicine is, but based on the time when they're in their fullest. And she told us about just the sun energy of this plant. I mean, it looks like a little sun, it's yellow like a sun, and its use is really great for depression and anxiety, especially seasonal affective disorder. Or basically like in the winter when you don't get enough vitamin D and you're feeling sad, you don't even know why sometimes. Like, this is actually prescribed by doctors in like a concentrated lab altered form, but it's still like based on this plant. It's just prescribed for depression for folks. I think the medicine's called SAM-E, and you can buy it in like health food stores and stuff too, or you could have a tea blend with this in it, and that's super helpful, or tincture. And actually when it tinctures, it turns like this purple red color. It's really cool. And also the leaves and the flowers, when crushed, especially when it's more in its fresher, more vibrant state, but it has like a slight purple color that comes out of it. So that hypericum, or I don't remember the name of the compound that does that, but pretty cool. And when you hold a leaf up to the light, you can see all the little purple dots. What?
Sorry, I'm just like zooming in and out by accident, but
No, it's okay.
got it.
iPhones. We're not editing this. I'm just gonna put it on there. I'm gonna share it as it is. It's fine. What was I saying? Okay, the leaves have, like when you hold the leaf up to the light, you can see like tiny little purple sacs and little holes in the leaf. It's really cool. And so when you crush it, you can see that purple coming out on your hand. So sometimes when I'm not sure if something's a hypericum, I'll like do that, and if it turns purple in my fingers, because there's a lot of different sort of little varieties of hypericum, and I've also seen it all over the country, different ones. You're like, oh, seems like that's a hypericum. Cool. Okay. Pretty sweet. It's also strong antiviral and really great go-to herb for like herpes outbreaks, and topically and internally. And I would use like some plant like Lomatium dissectum with that, in combination with that, which also grows wild out here. It's really, really strong antiviral. It's one of the biscuit roots. Lomatium and St. John's wort and lemon balm would probably be my three like major antivirals to put together. And people put it in oil and use it as like a massage oil or for sunburn, and or topical kind of ailments, skin ailments. But one thing to really remember about St. John's wort is that it can kind of make your any medications you might be on, it can make them not work as well. It makes it St. John's wort can make those things flush out of your body a little too fast. And so if you're on something like birth control, you want to just think about being careful, you know, or you're on a medicine you need for your life to exist. You know, I probably wouldn't even take St. John's wort if I was on a life-dependent pharmaceutical medication. So just something to note. I mean, you can look more into that and check the research. There's definitely been research done on this plant. Pretty sure the German government, when they funded the Commission E reports, which is a big research project they paid for, which our government has not done, and often will use some of that information in this country to gauge, like that scientific information is important, and so other people have been using it, but it was only done on some plants. This plant, there's some scientific studies out there on its medicine and that whole interaction with pharmaceuticals. So I would do some research on it, but it's a pretty wonderful herb to have around. And so around here, because it's so abundant and people feel like it's slightly invasive, I don't really know when we talk about what is invasive and not, what we actually gauge. Sometimes things that are native plants that have been here, people call invasive. So, and some things have been brought in and they really are just kind of compromising diversity, which is something that we feel like, a lot of people feel like is a gauge of ecological health. And so sometimes invasives can challenge that. But I do think they have a purpose. And I know the bees seem to like this plant. So I harvest a lot of it here. You can cut the tops. I mean, some people just harvest the buds or the flowers. But in this case, I think the whole top succulent part of it is really medicinal. So I'll cut the tops, go around and cut the tops, and then chop all that up and put it in oil or alcohol. So yeah, let's keep walking. A bit of some kind of vaccinium right here. Maybe huckleberry or blueberry. I mean, both huckleberry and blueberry are vacciniums, and really it's just a common name thing that they are considered different. I mean, one's more sour and the other's not. But I wrote a plant profile on blueberry this past winter, and there's a lot of like word and language sort of things that went with like, when colonizers came to the West Coast, they brought all these words with them and started to distinguish between these different vacciniums by calling them different common names. But people call huckleberry in New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, like a different plant is called huckleberry. So it's just a different variety, People just call blueberries huckleberry there, the ones that are not sour. So it's just a thing. But vacciniums are in the Ericaceae family, the heath family. What else is in that family? Madrone, manzanita, sourwood, which is a deciduous tree of the East Coast, heath. Yeah, plant families are pretty sweet. So, what else is right here? We've got more snowberry here, and pretty sure this is a Rocky Mountain maple we're passing by here. There's not many deciduous trees in this area, and this is one of them, and it's pretty sweet. Maple. And been carving a few spoons out of it. Pretty nice. And, maple has been used to make maple syrup in places that are more northern. I don't know people make that here out of these smaller trees. There's not a lot of huge Rocky Mountain maples here. They're more like this size, a lot of them. Some of them are a little bigger. In other places where maples grow, they can get pretty big, prominent members of the forest. But this one stays like this, at least as much as I've seen. And they just grow here like pretty abundantly, and Jim's always trying to thin them out a little bit, and so then we just make a lot of spoons and buttons. And we have this plant here called Ocean Spray. It's in the rose family. I don't know a ton about it other than I know it has some really nice wood, and that a lot of indigenous peoples in this area would tend this for arrow shoots. So they would coppice it back and harvest the long straight shoots for arrows, and they were really strong arrows. So pretty cool that it's past flowering at this point. really beautiful white flowers that spray out. Ocean spray. I don't really know why it's called ocean, but we have a little bit of a rose bush right here. There were roses flowering here when I first got here. Rose in the rose family. Here's a little rose. I don't know what species this is. Rose hip. So that flower has been pollinated, and I just picked it off, but it's okay. There's some wild strawberry right here too, also in the rose family. I haven't seen a lot of them around, but pretty cool. A lot of things in the rose family have slightly serrated leaves. They have 5 petals. Some of them have thorns, some do not. There's a hawthorn here and they have thorns. Some different fruit trees have thorns. A lot of our fruits, apricots, apples, pears, are all in the rose family. So it's pretty cool. Almonds are in the rose family. So our little oxeye daisy here. We have that. I remember we had that in North Carolina. More wild strawberry. I guess oxeye daisy leaves are edible. I thought I saw one down here. It's like my eye. This is an oxeye daisy plant. You can eat those little succulent leaves. It's in the Asteraceae family. Oxeye. Little Rubus here. I'm pretty sure this is black raspberry. Black raspberry. Black raspberry has, I just stepped on a thorn. Black raspberry has this glaucous stalk, and it's not angular. It's more rounded. Glaucous is this like kind of sheen here. And black raspberry, like other Rubus canes, have kind of a, they do this multi-year biennial like growth thing. So this stalk here doesn't have any berries because it's growing this year. It's putting a lot of energy into vegetative growth. And this one that has the fruits grew last year this way, and this year it's putting all its energy into making fruit. And these were probably the ones from last year. So once it makes fruit, it dies back like this. The cane does like a 2-year cycle, but the root stalk is still alive. So that's why a lot of people like to prune back their berry bushes so that they have a new growth spurt for making fruit. So we had when I worked at a farm in North Carolina, we had a big sort of field zone, like we would mow it back every couple years so that we had a big berry flush. So black raspberry, blackberry, raspberry, thimbleberry, salmonberry are all, pretty sure they're all Rubus genus, and they're all like kind of canes. They call them the canes. Some people do. And they all generally act in this way that I described, and I'm not sure, maybe thimbleberry has a little bit of a different thing, but maybe it's the same. And they're all in the rose family. So when you grow them, if you wanted to cultivate them, or if you wanted to tend them in the wild, you could, one thing that you could do to make the berries more abundant is to go and do a little bit of that kind of pruning in thicket areas so that the fruits have big flushes. So that is good for people and other animals too. To do a little like, I mean, you could just whack this back, and then the next year a lot more stuff will come up and more fruit will then come up too. So like I would maybe even cut out some of this dead stuff. You know, but what I do like about some of those thickets is leaving some of those areas thick.
Excuse me.
That was a bird that just flew by. Leaving some of it thick and gnarled so that the birds have a place to go be safe from predators, you know, little birdies. So, I'm not sure what kind of pine this is. It might be a western white pine because of the way that the whorls are happening here, and I believe it has 5 needles. Let me find one that won't fall apart. Yeah, 5 needles. That's a white pine group characteristic. It might be western white pine. Need to look that up. Identifying pines. So this is a Pinus genus plant in the plant family Pinaceae, which is shared by, your fir that I showed you, and hemlock, and spruce, and the larch is also in that family. It's all called the pine family, even though this is a Pinus in the pine family. And again, everything in the pine family is a conifer, and not everything is evergreen, and they all have cones. There's a cone right there. That's a distinguishing characteristic of what species it could be. And when I have actually looked this up while I've been here, and I'm pretty sure it's a western white pine.